Welcome back to the 6th Annual SDG Business Forum. We hope you've been enjoying the sessions and the fantastic conversations. My name is Maggie Lake. I am your host and MC for today's event. Let's get started with our final panel discussion of the day, Sustainable Export Finance. As we've heard from so many of our speakers today, the global community has fewer than 10 years left to deliver on the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals and needs to take immediate and rapid action. Without large-scale and new investments into infrastructure, clean energy, water and sanitation, and agriculture, estimated at $5 to $7 trillion a year, the transition towards a low-carbon, more resource-efficient, and fair economy simply cannot be achieved. The financial services industry has already taken important steps to mobilize the required investments. There has been a flood of innovation in the industry, with new products aimed at channeling capital towards projects that achieve positive environmental and social impacts. Export finance has a key role to play in the transition. Export credit agencies, working closely with their banking partners, have a track record of delivering investments at scale. And yet, transactions which could be classified as sustainable are currently only 20% of all export finance deals. That needs to change. The ICC and the Rockefeller Foundation have released a white paper authored by Sdg Impact Capital and International Financial Consulting to ensure that the export finance industry contributes rapidly and meaningfully to the sustainability agenda. Today, we are lucky to have Diana Smallridge, the President and CEO of International Financial Consulting, to lead the sustainable export finance discussion. But before we start the panel, let's hear from two experts on this important topic. Amadou Hott, Minister of Economy, Planning and Cooperation of the Republic of Senegal, and Agnes Kalibata, Special Envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure for me to participate virtually in this great forum. First, I would like to congratulate the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the UN Global Compact, and the International Chamber of Commerce for organizing this important gathering, which offers a unique opportunity to drive pivotal momentum towards achieving the SDGs. I would also like to acknowledge the ICC's and Rockefeller Foundation's initiative for the launch of the white paper on sustainability in export finance. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how vulnerable the world can be and that a business-as-usual approach no longer works. This situation reminds us of the need for urgent actions and for more focus on SDGs to achieve a sustainable development for our countries. Export finance has a key role to play under these circumstances. Sustainable development can be in the DNA of export finance, as a number of its transactions are related to the development of infrastructure with tangible economic and social impacts in emerging countries, such as hospitals, power production facilities, sanitations, roads, etc. Senegal and many other countries benefited from this instrument, which is complementary to those of multilateral development banks and other development finance institutions. However, export finance still come with several constraints in terms of processes, the content of commercial contracts, the overall high cost, considering the premium to be paid, the interest rate, and the government's contribution that is required, which is usually funded with expensive commercial credits. Also, the maturities imposed by OECD rules can be quite short compared to the lifetime of the assets to be financed. Channeling more ECA funding to finance the achievements of SDGs will require a more creative approach with the possibility to adapt the product to the needs of our countries. This will require efforts from all players, including the OECD and banks, but also from governments and the private sector that can be incentivized for using these new tools. For instance, a way of making ECAs more attractive to fund climate and environmental friendly projects is to allow the sponsor to pay a reduced premium with a reduced margin, but with much longer maturities when it comes to financing these projects. OECD can also set a minimum percentage of green projects in each ECA's portfolio. Broadly speaking, if we want ECAs to really finance SDGs, we could consider the following ideas: to transform OECD rules and put together innovative mechanisms allowing ECAs to offer loans with maturities between 30 and 40 years, including longer grace periods and interest rates below 1%, for example, while complying with the same rules. This could be achieved by channeling, for example, grants available from donors so that ECAs can offer blended finance. To lower the requirements in terms of ECA countries' content for a specific commercial contract to be funded in order to further involve local private sector and to participate in their capacity building. This is key to achieving sustainable and inclusive growth. To put together instruments that will enable export finance in local currencies. Also to set up, for example, other instruments in partnership with DFIs and other MDBs for providing concessional financing to the beneficiary countries to cover their 15% contribution required in ECA transactions. The purpose of this is to secure a competitive package to fund projects at the lowest cost of capital possible and to ensure their quick execution. Furthermore, ECAs need to show more flexibility with regards to their processes, which need to be faster as achieving SDGs is very urgent. Finally, new export finance products should be attractive to the private sector as well, and should also be more flexible to enable the private sector to use ECA's financing more effectively. Indeed, many countries pursuing SDGs face higher level of debt and need private sector investments in SDGs projects, but ECAs often prefer projects guaranteed by the governments. Let's all be creative and make the necessary reforms to foster export finance for a shared, sustainable prosperity. Thank you for your attention.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this year's SDG Business Forum, which is taking place on the eve of the UN Food Systems Summit. I want to thank the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the UN Global Compact, and International Chamber of Commerce for your collective leadership in convening this timely discussion. Thank you also for the support you have given us over the last 18 months of the summit. As the Secretary General's Special Envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, I'm a big advocate of transforming our global food system to deliver on the 2030 agenda. I would like to make the following critical points. First, we are not on track to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and to that, we urgently need to transform our current food systems. Food, from production to consumption, is the world's largest economic sector, but it generates hidden environmental, health, and poverty costs. The hidden cost of food is estimated to be $12 trillion a year and is expected to rise to $16 trillion by 2050. This is unacceptable. In the summit process, We have started referring to this as the true cost of food. Second, it is critical to recognize the interconnectedness of the global challenges we are facing and how businesses can play a critical role in rethinking and reengineering our food system to address these challenges. Business already is making important contribution to reducing hunger, creating jobs, and ending poverty. However, in order to get back on track towards delivering on the 2030 agenda, we need to change business models. I want to share some examples emerging from the summit process where businesses can lead transformation through their value chains. I encourage you to work closely with farmers on value chains and invest in regenerative agricultural practices that mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss. I want to challenge you to advocate for decent work in your business networks and to aim to achieve poverty-free value chains by 2030. This brings me to my third point. I would like to encourage you to engage in multi-stakeholder commitments where you cannot come through on your own. Throughout the past 18 months, we have heard from different constituencies. Over 145 countries have participated in national dialogues. Nearly 800 independent dialogues have taken place around the world. We have collected thousands of game-changing ideas from thousands of people engaged in action tracks, levers of change, and the scientific group. We have heard from all constituencies of society. All in all, 5 action areas have emerged from the summit process as the primary areas through which we can demonstrate progress towards the 2030 agenda. And these include nourishing all people, boosting nature-based solutions of production, advancing equitable livelihoods, decent work, and empowered communities, building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stresses, and support to means of implementation. We need to anchor all these efforts in countries' priorities and needs and to connect to the wealth of ideas and resources and multi-stakeholder initiatives that we have seen emerge out of the summit process. In conclusion, I want to say that all this was to prepare us for action, but also for ambition. The time to act is now. We are counting on your individual and collective leadership to bring us back on track towards delivering on the 2030 agenda. Make sure your commitment counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalibata. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Mr. Roberto Suárez Santos, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you for inviting us to join to this important panel of sustainable export finance. We come ready to work with you on identifying how export finance can better support the achievement of the 2030 agenda. We all agree that the world of economy and international trade have suffered during the pandemic, worsening the already decade-long slowdown of global trade growth. According to the World Trade Organization, in 2022, trade will likely grow by just 4%, with the total volume of global trade remaining below the pre-pandemic trend. The impact of this trade slowdown in many producing countries, developing economies, without proper access to finance, nor to social protection safety nets, and weak institutions, has been devastating for people, companies, and societies. We at IOE, we have called, together with other partners, on governments to pursue global initiatives that mitigate the impact of trade disruption in place with an sustainable social infrastructure. As an example, we, together with the International Trade Union Organization, the International Labour Organization, different local business organizations, and more than 100 global grants in the textile sector, undertook action to mobilize resources and set up a new basis for social protection when supply chains are not functioning. We firmly believe that trade and trade integration, if properly channeled and underpinned by multinational institutions and international accepted rules, goes hand in hand with inclusive growth, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda acknowledges this. Recent surveys show how proper trade flows can really help to get people out of poverty. How we can maximize the contribution of export finance to sustainable development. Export finance has an essential role to play as an enabler for expanding sustainable international trade. IOE, together with other business partners under the Italian B20 presidency, made concrete proposals and recommendations for improving access to trade finance and boost the economy recovery post-pandemic. Colleagues, let me share a few reflections with you. First, export finance is only one piece of a much broader agenda. Strengthening the rule of law at the country level in many areas of the world is critical. Address with ambition, corruption, and informality is also critical. Promote responsible business conduct in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and ensure that trade and investment treaties are human rights compatible must all be part of a comprehensive strategy. IOE recently launched some specific recommendations on how to align international trade investment agreements and human rights. The point I want to make is that we need to aim to better connect the dots across different policy objectives. Second, our main focus should be to identify and provide stronger support to projects and specific actions which are particularly impactful towards achieving the SDGs. For instance, pursuing decarbonization programs. But we think that a small first approach is needed to ensure easy and transparent access to export finance for small and medium companies. The SMEs are the backbone of many economies. In some regions, almost 20% of companies, mainly SMEs, have not been able to survive. We should be careful avoiding unnecessary burdens for them to grow. Enhancing trade, which is the main function of export finance, if properly channeled, has proved to be, per se, a powerful tool to promote the Agenda 2030. Third, a level playing field for export finance is key not only for fair trade systems, but also to guarantee that the main exporters are adhering to a common sustainability agenda. Unilateral approaches will have very limited impact by making access to finance too complex or too restricted to a few, and will undermine the entire international trade system and put many SMEs in a disadvantage. Four, we need to develop a robust understanding on what export finance means for sustainability. The issue of renewable energy seems to be very straightforward. We were very impressed by the pledge of the Chinese leader, Mr. Xi Jinping, who stated yesterday that China would not build new coal-fired power projects abroad. However, export finance needs to expand its horizon beyond energy. It's also about employment. It's also about education. It's also about social infrastructure, health. A broader approach is needed. And fifth, as so often, efficient partnerships and better cooperation is key. On one side, in many countries, we are far from optimal when setting up PPPs. There is a lack of alignment in language, objectives, deliverables, timelines between the private sector and its international organizations. On the other side, development finance and export finance are increasingly involved in the same type of projects. Trade investment and development cooperation are interlinked. We must develop strategies to ensure better coordination and complementarity of both. Colleagues, we are on the same page. IOE will be calling in a very determined manner for a better use of export finance toward achieving the Agenda 2030. But global partnerships, which involve business, the finance sector, governments, and different stakeholders are essential. We all need to engage responsibly. IOE and its representative and independent business organization in 150 countries are fully committed to support these efforts. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Diana Smallridge, and I'm the President and CEO of International Financial Consulting. Let me first of all, thank Minister Hott and Dr. Kalibata and of course, Mr. Suárez Santos for their really important messages, emphasizing the need to align financing flows to the UN SDGs, which I like to call the world's to-do list. Channeling finance towards SDGs and closing the persistent financing gaps requires partnerships between governments, financial institutions, and corporates, and is particularly important in emerging markets. Today, we've gathered a group of industry leaders to discuss how we can leverage export finance to address some of the most pressing challenges our global community is now facing. For those of you not familiar with the export finance market, it has a strong record of delivering capital investments at scale in countries and in sectors where private capital does not naturally flow. So how it works, a loan granted to an importer is secured by a sovereign guarantor, namely an export credit agency in the exporter's home market. With a track record of more than 100 years, export finance can really be seen as a poster child for cooperation between the financial sector, the global business community, and governments. Really, despite these facts, export finance is often overlooked in the broader sustainable finance conversation, and its full potential as a driver of sustainable development remains untapped. We have less than 10 years to achieve the SDGs and only 7 years on the carbon clock for a 1.5 degree Celsius scenario. So we can no longer afford to ignore the potential and risk misallocating scarce capital. Instead, financial institutions and ECAs and corporates must act fast to unleash export finance as a sustainable finance product. That's why today the ICC, with the support of Rockefeller Foundation, is launching this white paper that identifies a roadmap to boost the sustainable profile of the export finance market. The white paper is the first review of the state of sustainability across export finance. It's been co-authored by Sdg Impact Capital and our firm, following an extensive market consultation with over 500 market participants from ECAs, government authorities, banks, buyers, exporters, industry associations, civil society, et cetera. And it presents both policy and product recommendations. But before we get into further discussion about how export finance can contribute meaningfully to the sustainability agenda and what role it plays in addressing the global challenges we're all facing, let me introduce to you my esteemed panelists. I have with me Mr. Richard Wainwright. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Investec Bank. He joined Investec Bank in 1995 and has been CEO since 2016. He was appointed MD of Investec Limited in September 2020. Investec is a South African international banking and wealth management group that provides a range of financial products and services to a client base in Europe, South Africa, Southern Africa, and Asia Pacific. Next on our panel is Mairead Lavery. She's the President and CEO of Export Development Canada. EDC is Canada's export credit agency. Mairead was appointed in 2019. And I want to point out she's the first woman to occupy the CEO role in its more than 75-year plus history. Under her direction, EDC's pursued ambitious objectives, helping Canadian companies to do business in more than 200 markets around the world and generating some $100 billion in trade and investment annually. In 2020, EDC was a major contributor to the Government of Canada's COVID-19 response, delivering billions of dollars in liquidity across Canada to companies. Mairead is also on the board of, or the chair of the board of EDC subsidiary FinDev, which is Canada's international DFI. Next is Adam Connaker, who's the Director of Innovative Finance at the Rockefeller Foundation. His work focuses on identifying and shaping new financial solutions which address some of the world's most challenging issues in promotion of the Foundation's mission to benefit humanity. Prior to joining Rockefeller, Adam worked in a private equity firm focusing on distressed debt. And finally, amongst our esteemed panelists, Marie Aglert, who's a director of EKN, the Swedish Export Credit Agency. She's director of large corporates at EKN since 2017, and also a member of the board at the International Council of Swedish Industry, and member of the board, advisory board of Modvion, a company that designs wind power towers. So welcome all of you. It's a pleasure to be moderating with you. So let's kick off our discussion with Adam from the Rockefeller Foundation. Adam, export finance is not a natural place for the foundation. Please tell us a bit more about what Rockefeller's interest in export finance is and why did it get involved in the white paper?
Thanks, Diana, and really appreciate the intros and the opportunity to be on the panel. I think you're absolutely right. This isn't a natural place for a foundation to necessarily play, but maybe it goes back a bit to our history. I mean, Rockefeller's was founded in 1913. It's over 100 years old. And up until World War II was the largest American giver of foreign aid, larger than the US government itself. And one of the things that I highlight in that, in that history is not so much that we're an old institution, but that we've seen a long change in the evolution of what the development sector faces in terms of achieving its goals. Today's development challenges are not what we faced in the early 1900s when we were beginning this work. The scale has gone so far beyond what we have in terms of resources from the philanthropic or even the public sector to address and to fill the gaps. And so, at Rockefeller, we've really taken to the thinking that if we want to really address the challenges of the 21st century, we need to begin to work with the biggest tools that we've got. And the biggest tool on planet Earth is the capital markets. It is thinking about what private capital and investment can do. That's where $300 trillion sits. And that's really the best chance we have to fund some of the biggest things we need in infrastructure and social development and other aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we launched a program called Zero Gap. It focuses on closing the financing gap in emerging markets, in developed markets across the world for the Sustainable Development Goals. And to do it, we've really focused our team and our institution on thinking about how do we bridge private capital toward the things that are really critical to solve, like climate change, inequality, things like that. And so my own team, what we focus on is really sort of structuring new financial products, thinking about where the markets aren't going and what it would take to really highlight and identify and quite frankly, just, open up that market for private capital to flow. And so a number of years ago, we began looking at what's it going to take in emerging markets to really think about a lot of the infrastructure needs, a lot of the social infrastructure needs specifically. And how do we begin to get affordable, repeatable capital into those markets that have been so difficult to unlock for a long time? And the thing that still kind of shocks me to this day is that export credit and export trade finance has been sort of unknown for so long in this development sector, and yet it's operating in the markets we want to be in, right? I mean, it is by far and away one of the biggest players, if not the biggest player, in most of the markets that we're trying to go into, that we're setting up new institutions and new financial instruments for. And so we really began to think about how do we engage export credit? How do we begin to actually work with export credit so that it can finance a wider myriad of things that also would help us get some of these projects off the ground and capitalized. And so for us, this was sort of a natural fit, actually, in the sense that export credit is the bank that's doing what we want, what we want to do in the markets we want to do it. And the real challenge wasn't so much about, is it the right bank? It's about how do we really unlock some of the other projects like hospitals, schools, roads, the types of things that are also critical infrastructure. But as was alluded to at the top of this panel, this is not necessarily where the export credit capital is flowing most naturally right now. And so, we started by saying, how can we get creative? What would actually allow this market to tick? What would allow it to go deeper in its participation in this space? And so we started by funding Acre Impact Capital, which has been mentioned as a co-author of the paper, to really begin to look at some of the aspects of where does the capital flow, who is doing it right now in terms of social infrastructure investment. But more importantly, what are the issues? What makes these deals more unique and difficult? And what would it take to really spur participation? And there are some challenges. I'll say that some of these deals might be slightly smaller. Some of these deals might have difficult attracting the commercial participation of 15% that was alluded to. Those kinds of things. But these deals are very financeable. They look very similar to the other deals. And so this is really, I think, now a fantastic opportunity, quite frankly, just to really invite export credit into the development sector's objectives. There's a huge, enormous financing need, and export credit is a massive tool that's been left on the sidelines for far too long in terms of being able to participate. So, we're excited. No, it's not a natural fit for an institution like mine that gives away 5% of its endowment every year. But I do think, in our own shift in thinking towards how do we scale up our solutions, export credit was a really, really exciting opportunity for us.
Oh, fantastic, Adam. That's such a helpful explanation. And I think it speaks to the real value export finance plays in the global agenda. Maybe to Richard. We've already heard quite a bit about the opportunities for export finance in financing the SDGs. And as an Anglo-South African banking group, you have extensive experience in financing large infrastructure investments. So from your perspective, Richard, what role does export finance play in emerging markets, particularly in Africa?
Thank you very much. Export finance is often underappreciated in the context of development conversations. It's a little known fact that the industry provides financing volumes that are equivalent to that of the DFIs and MDBs combined, most of which is flowing towards emerging markets. Export finance plays a very important role in Africa. Last year, over $30 billion was arranged, but it could have been much bigger given the acknowledged infrastructure financing gap on the continent of over $100 billion per year, according to the African Development Bank. This is because export finance has key attributes which make it unique and beneficial for Africa. It is not fair weather finance. For over 100 years, ECAs have been supporting essential infrastructure financing developing markets in good times and less good times. It's part of their DNA. They understand how to ensure infrastructure can be delivered responsibly, working with banks through the credit cycle. This includes ensuring the infrastructure represents value for money, undertaking a comprehensive environmental and social diligence, checking the financing is sustainable and affordable, structuring the loan so that the contractor building the infrastructure only gets paid when he delivers on key milestones during construction. They also offer long repayment terms, for instance, 14 years for rail, 18 years for climate-related investments. This goes way beyond what other markets can offer in these sectors. This makes infrastructure investment in these sectors more affordable in Africa. This is important for us at Investec. As our home is Africa, we are an African bank. We're already a major financier of renewable energy on the continent, but we want to do more. One of Investec's most cherished values is that we strive to live in society and not off it. It is a deeply held belief and not one that we encourage to all of our staff to live by. We are passionate about investing our time and resources into businesses and activities that will ensure our grandchildren and their grandchildren enjoy a life of purpose and meaning. As a business, we take centrally the issue of inequality, and we do our utmost to address sustainable development, helping Africa's populations access to essential services. This was one of the reasons why we joined the United Nations CEO Alliance of Global Investors for Sustainable Development. Specifically on the white paper, I'm excited to understand how the ECA market can grow its support for social infrastructure in Africa. Sectors such as water, sanitation, health, education, and housing, and improve its affordability. This sort of infrastructure has a dramatic, direct, and immediate impact on people's lives. Often taken for granted in OECD countries, it's just not available in many parts of Africa. A good example of this is the Western Regional Hospitals in Ghana, which Investec recently financed with the support of my colleagues here on the panel from EKN, and also the ECIC in South Africa. This project alone will dramatically improve access to healthcare to a population of over 3 million people in the region. It is the first of what we hope will be many such loans to be classified by Acre Capital to be in line with Loan Market Association social loan principles.
Thanks so much, Richard. That's a very encouraging set of comments. And I want to then speak to you, Mairead, about a broader industry perspective, your experience in the industry, how export credit agencies as government-owned financing instruments are positioning themselves towards these global commitments, such as SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Could you share with us some specific targets and goals EDC has set and what developments you're anticipating, particularly at the OECD level within your cohort of OECD ECAs and the broader industry?
Yes, thank you, Diana, and thank you for the invite to be with you today. I think you're seeing a clear shift among the ECA community and recognizing the role that they play vis-a-vis the infrastructure that Richard was just speaking about. Certainly the pandemic, if we didn't recognize it before, the pandemic certainly has made that extremely obvious, as many ECAs were engaged in stimulus in their own country and understanding the interconnectedness of business, the community, as well as government. So that has been, I would suggest, a bit of a wake-up call on the role of export credit agencies. Prior to that, and really if I could speak to the experience that EDC has had, it's perhaps indicative of the shift overall in the export credit agency world. You know, really with the Paris Agreement, that was an opportunity for ECAs to reflect very specifically on climate action and with respect to that SDG goal. And really it led us early 2016 to start to look at what we call the CSR framework and how would we align all of our activities linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. That led us in 2019 to publish a climate change policy, closely followed by a human rights policy, again, very clearly linked to the Paris Agreement and to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So you started to see export credit agencies actually build their own tools as to how they would contribute to these larger goals for the world. Following that in 2020, we actually linked very clearly our overall corporate strategy to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we called them out, and I think that's an incredibly important part of what we signal to our exporters, what we signal to our partners, what we signal to the companies we work with around the world, as well as signaling to our employees that at EDC, we stand in support of the SDG goals 8, 9, 7, 10, 16, 13, and 7. So really important that we say this is how we actually contribute, because once we start measuring how we're doing, then I think we will actually start to see even more progress. So you mentioned targets, Diana. Let me share with you a little bit on that. I would say the targets are very much more in the space. You see them more obviously in the space of climate today. In July, we announced our net zero commitment. We also announced a further reduction in the carbon intensity of our portfolio. We also indicated that we will be coming out with interim targets, as well as our own operational target for net zero by 2030. So really clear targets that we will use to drive the portfolio and drive EDC towards over the next number of years. I would say it's not as obvious as you get into the areas of responsible business and human rights and perhaps business integrity, but we do that in a different way. We do that with very clear policies and very clear standards. So I think those are some of the ways internally that we can really indicate our support for the SDGs. But you mentioned a really important factor, which is the OECD and the importance of the OECD. You know, all export credit agencies, we certainly want to work with respect to the level playing field. We heard that in the opening comments. Therefore, the OECD consensus and the rules with which we operate under are very important. And certainly within Canada, we would like to see a modernization of the OECD rules. We would like to see some of the sector better understandings advance further and perhaps embrace some of the ideas the Minister shared with us at the start of this session. So there's an opportunity, certainly, and there's a desire on the face of many countries to see a modernization of the OECD consensus. There's also an opportunity to, I think, enhance our standards and be very clear about what standards export credit agencies are operating under. So I think we all experience the plethora of standard setting bodies today, but the more clarity that export credit agencies can work under, whether it's Equator Principles, whether it's TCFD as an example of a disclosure standard, whether it's the IFC standards, I think that will help the export credit community actually come together and be very specific about what has to happen. As Richard was talking about in our due diligence practices, what is it that we expect to see, and what is the reward for actually investing in sustainable projects and initiatives for our partners, for our co-investors, and for the project sponsors themselves. So I would say there's an opportunity to change regulation. There's certainly an opportunity for the export credit agencies to focus on their products and the overall standards that the community operate in. Those would all be great targets to actually reorient ECAs even more towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
And I guess it starts with recognizing that the mandate of an ECA to promote national exports is not incongruous with supporting SDGs. So, Maria, I'd like to ask you, as head of department of the large corporates at EKN, the Swedish ECA, I mean, you very much live around the needs of large Swedish exporters. So what are some of the challenges they are facing when they're reporting to you and in promoting the sustainability agenda, particularly in emerging markets? And what kind of support can they expect from EKN to make these transactions more sustainable?
Thank you. Yes, I think Swedish exporters, I mean, they have a long history of developing sustainable solutions, and Swedish exporters are committed to deliver on UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, these high-quality products with an expected long lifetime often comes with a high initial investment cost, which makes them less affordable in emerging markets. The total cost of ownership is an important aspect of an investment, and here ECA financing can help reduce the investment barriers for these sustainable solutions and make them affordable. EKN, we have a very flexible approach when it comes to sourcing, and we can finance a whole infrastructure investment as long as at least 30% is purchased from Sweden. This means that the bank can offer the investor a loan with very long tenors and competitive rates, and as it is guaranteed by EKN and the Swedish state. I could give you a very recent example of this. The city of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso has invested in a new sustainable transport solution with financing guaranteed by EKN. This investment includes buses from the Swedish bus manufacturer Scania. But in addition to the buses, the investment also included a whole system, such as bus depots, education of local drivers and mechanics, fleet management, and the development of local alternative fuel solutions to eventually achieve a fleet of buses that is 100% biodiesel. This is a project with a strong social and environmental effect. But I would also like to add another aspect with ECA financing. It is not actually only the project itself that supports SDGs, but it is also enhanced by the sustainability requirements that comes with an export credit financing. When we support financing of a project, like the hospital in Ghana that was mentioned earlier, or this transport solution in Burkina Faso, we look at the sustainability beyond the product in order to get the full impact. We look at the whole infrastructure project. This could be human rights, workers' health and safety in the project, biodiversity impact, or it could be making sure that people who have had to leave their land get properly compensated. All of this is also part of an ECA export finance package. But I think the challenge can sometimes be the lack of local capacity to meet the requirements that comes with an export financing. The local stakeholders may not always have the competence, for example, to set up an environment and sustainability assessment report. And to address this challenge, I think ECAs need to be more innovative in collaboration with local and international partners at a very early stage of a project. We may also set requirements as part of our guarantees that the budget needs to be in place to our local partners. So I think that is the main challenges in going forward. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. That's a really helpful description. Adam, I want to go back to you about some of the feedback that we received in preparing the white paper that suggested that various forms of official financing continue to act in isolation and there's a lack of alignment. And you explained that at Rockefeller, you're specialized in, among other areas, innovative finance and unlocking private capital for impact. So how would you see this export finance area fitting alongside other official sources of finance and working together?
Yeah, Diana, I think it's an incredible opportunity actually at the moment, right, to combine the sectors. I mean, I want to be clear on one thing. You know, my expectation is not that ECAs become development finance institutions. A lot of that infrastructure has already been set up through the development banks, the development finance institutions, the other multilateral efforts and initiatives and institutions that have been set up to do exactly these things. And I think the opportunity here really is to think about, you know, how do they work with ECAs and how do ECAs leverage some of the opportunities that exist in those other institutions and that infrastructure that's already been set up. You know, one example that comes to mind, and again, these examples are drawn out in the paper quite well, but it's, you know, in some of these projects, there will be decision points between diesel and solar in a hospital, or there will be decision points around a more or less Paris-aligned version of the project. And I think this is a great opportunity for some of the efforts that, you know, the development sector has already put in place, like the Green Climate Fund, like some of the development finance institutions, to come in and quite frankly, help to make that decision for the ECA, right? Help to guide the ECA towards the more Paris-aligned version of the project, or the more sort of, you know, development sector aligned version of the project. And so, you know, for me, I agree that these two have not always played together. They strangely are investing in the same markets. But as I see this, the development sector has set up an enormous amount of infrastructure to be able to do this kind of blending, to be able to do this kind of guiding, and to spur some of these markets that we hope the ECAs are able to participate in or pick up in the long run. And I think this is really just the opportunity to get more intentional about how we do that, and to really ask the ECAs to get involved, but also to ask the ECAs and the development finance institutions to work together on some of these efforts, because I really do think that that's where the opportunity sits for achieving the SDGs.
Exactly. Richard, I want to go back to you then. From your perspective, and maybe I'll ask this if we have time to everybody, but I'll start with you, Richard. From your perspective, what's required to better align export finance with the SDGs and ultimately grow the share of sustainable export finance?
Investec is an African bank. We are relatively unique in that we have an international export finance leader-ranging capability. What has been critical to our success has been our ability to access ECA finance guarantee and direct funding programs. These allow us to tap into competitively priced hard currency funding and lead a range. Some ECAs are very open to and have programs for this, whilst others do not have programs or exclude African banks because of their country ratings. In order to encourage more African banks and, of course, allow us as Investec to do more business, we would welcome more outreach from the ECA community to bring African banks into the market. After all, we live in this continent, know it best, and have the local relationships. This makes us ideal partners for ECAs and exporters looking to grow their SDG activities in Africa. On the question of aligning export finance with SDGs, I would like to again stress that the affordability is a key investment. The OECD 18-year repayment terms for renewable energy projects had a significant impact on developers' willingness to invest in the technology and projects. The same is true for rail. The recent Ghana Western Rail transaction we co-arranged with EKN and the South African ECIC allowed for 14-year repayment terms, allowing the government to invest in a project costing over 600 million euros, but with long-term sustainability benefits, moving trucks and traffic off the roads and providing access to markets from previously poor connected parts of the country. Both of these types of projects generate revenues. Social infrastructure such as hospitals, educational facilities, water infrastructure, etc., on the other hand, often cost governments money to operate even after the cost of putting the infrastructure in place. It could be argued that these sorts of projects are even more deserving of longer-term repayment methods. This could improve affordability for the private sector and the governments to invest and, importantly, help them manage their debt repayment obligations, as well as meet the cost of operating the infrastructure. It is even more relevant now in the context of the current COVID debt relief programs. In closing, we welcome the publication of this landmark white paper. The export finance market has an unprecedented opportunity before it to take collective and coordinated action and to realize its potential to play a major role in the delivery of the sustainability agenda. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Richard. Mairead, 2 minutes. Can you give some insights, what you think, how to better align export finance with SDGs?
I think there's two words, Diana. One is partnership and the other one is company. Partnerships, no one can do this on their own. And as the head of an organization that has a DFI as a subsidiary, I very well understand the link between export credit and DFI world, but it's that commercial link. And then it's the link to the exporter as well. So it's this ecosystem and how you build that ecosystem of support. So export credit with the rules, the standards, the regulations, the diligence that we do, we can bring something to the table, but it's something that's part of an ecosystem of support for the exporters, for the sponsors, so we can help drive the behaviors all together. So I think the more clear we get about our ability to work in partnership, and the more we make our exporters and sponsors enthusiastic about the Sustainable Development Goals, the bigger opportunity we all have.
Super. And you, Marie, from your perspective?
I think you have to be innovative, and I think if I could comment on we have a new climate council at ICANN, which is part of the Swedish government's export strategy. Could I comment on that? Because
yes,
I think
please.
That is a way of. Yes, I think that's a perfect way of using the export credit to contribute to the 2030 agenda and also to contribute to the global climate transition. So we have formed a scientific climate council at ICANN to offer us scientifically based solution to these challenges. I think this is actually the first of its kind in the export finance field. And the challenge we see on the day-to-day business is that the world needs such a quick transition, and at the same time, low and middle income countries need to develop their energy supplies and infrastructure to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And for us as a financial institution, this naturally entails the management of complex topics. And as such, it is important that we base our strategic decisions on current science and facts, in addition to the dialogues we already have with companies, banks, and civil society. So the Climate Council that we have set up focus on the impact that export finance has on global greenhouse gas emissions. And it works like a discussion partner for us, and it has no operation role, so to say, in the individual business transactions. So I think my vision at least would be that we would have a similar council for the OECD. To really contribute to the Paris Agreement, I think we all have to be aligned. And it's important, of course, that the discussions and decisions are made are based on the current science, particularly since the changes happens so very, very fast. Thank you.
Excellent. Adam, your additional comments, I think you've been on very much closely associated with the white paper, so you may have very distinct insights as to what specific actions to align export finance with SDGs. Any comments from you?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I want to go back to something you were saying before as well, and then we'll close it out. But I think it comes down to the fact that export finance is, it has a history of financing in emerging markets alongside the DFIs in this ecosystem that was described. But it's at a much larger scale. And so I think it really comes down to how do they leverage each other? How do they get more intentional about, about financing the SDGs and really thinking about the role they can play? I think, if you look historically at what ECAs have done, they've been involved and they've been a huge part of the story of many of the critical technology rollouts that have occurred in emerging markets. They've been involved in major infrastructure builds in the power sector and the energy sector. So this is not new in any way for the ECA market. I think what we're asking here is really, or maybe not asking, what we're inviting is that the ECAs become much more central in the discussion about how we're going to finance the SDGs, and that they become, as was described, part of that ecosystem of the development finance institutions, or they become aligned to that ecosystem. And so I think it's a huge opportunity. I don't think this is meant to be, let's try and redirect the SDA or the ECAs. I think this is really just an enormous opportunity to get more intentional involved in what is the fight of a lifetime here to finance some very important but expensive goals.
Well, that's quite right. And as a wrap up, let me just note for those of you who are interested in the report, the white paper, about how we can grow the share of sustainable export finance and showcase to the broader sustainable finance industry the potential of this export finance business. Please download the white paper. It's on the ICC website. I think you'll find it a good read. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that still much more can be done. So before we close off the session, I just want to give a very warm and sincere thanks to our panelists for your valuable insights and congratulate you on your achievements in positioning and mobilizing export finance towards our shared global sustainability commitments. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for that great conversation. And it was so wonderful to see so many of you commenting and connecting on the chat. Marco from Rome, Sigrid from Norway, Simon from Nairobi, Yoda from Cameroon. Great to see the engagement. Now, please welcome Akim Steiner, Administrator for the UN Development Program, who's providing the latest update on the COVID-19 Private Sector Global Facility, a global initiative and collaboration bringing together public and private sector partners to help local communities recover better from the pandemic.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. It is a privilege to address this SDG Business Forum during a pivotal UN General Assembly. The COVID-19 pandemic is upending how we live, work, and cooperate. At the same time, other multidimensional challenges are daunting, not least rising poverty, growing inequalities, and a climate crisis that is now widespread, rapid, and intensifying. Yet, there are reasons to be hopeful. We have seen how communities and countries have rallied to quickly mobilize vital resources to fight the pandemic. The private sector has often been at the center of these efforts as a provider of technology, innovation, skills, services, and employment. The challenge now is to build on this momentum and ensure that the private sector continues to play perhaps an even bigger role in contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is critical as the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries has increased by $1.7 trillion in the year 2020, a 70% rise on pre-pandemic levels. At the United Nations Development Programme, we are helping the private sector to better align their investments with the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Sdg Impact Initiative is at the heart of these efforts. To date, it has identified over 200 SDG investment opportunities in 14 countries, encompassing everything from the agri-food sector to infrastructure or energy. To take just one example, Banco Colombia, Colombia's largest bank, is developing several new investment opportunities with our support and the mapping of SDG opportunities. These new openings cover everything from renewable energy to supporting women entrepreneurs. Sdg Impact is also developing a series of standards that apply to the different facets of SDG finance. With this support, Mexico became the first country in the world to issue an SDG bond in 2020, valued at $890 million. We have also cooperated with Uzbekistan and the New Development Bank in China to issue SDG bonds, both valued in the $800 million range, each of them. Other efforts will help to build on these trailblazing financial instruments. For instance, the OECD UNDP framework for SDG-aligned finance is now helping public and private actors to make new investments that will shift trillions of dollars towards SDG-aligned investments. The United Nations is also forging fresh forms of collaboration with the private sector. Consider the COVID-19 Private Sector Global Facility, which UNDP helped to launch 1 year ago with our partners such as the UN Global Compact, the International Chamber of Commerce, and DHL, PwC, and Microsoft. To take just one example of its work, the Global Facility is strengthening health systems in 10 countries, including in South Sudan and Djibouti, a process driven by the private sector and the use of digital technologies. Other mechanisms like the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group are helping to actively shape the future of finance. With UNDP serving as its secretariat, it is outlining ways to boost the alignment of public and private finance with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. Remarkably, aligning just 1% of the $379 trillion of total assets held by banks, institutional investors, and asset managers could be enough to fill the annual SDG financing gap, just 1%. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the private sector now has a central role to play in spurring a game-changing SDG investment push. That includes our response to monumental challenges like climate change. So I urge you, as the private sector, to please see the United Nations and, amongst the United Nations family, also UNDP, as a critical partner for you. Wherever you may be across the globe, at this inflection point for people and planet, we must work even more closely together to realize that greener and more inclusive and ultimately more sustainable future. Thank you.